Okay, I think we're seeing quite a lot of people have joined the call. I'm quite tempted to get going, if that's okay for everybody, because we do quite literally have a packed agenda. There's a lot to get through, and I'm absolutely delighted so many people have signed up. So just want to make sure that we get that chance to get into the issues and the debates. Just a little bit of setting the scene and some practical details whilst we're getting started. This is a joint event between Engender and Shelter Scotland, and we're delighted to be launching this research today, and I'll set some of the context for that. But just in terms of some housekeeping, we have invited people to put questions forward before the event, and we'll make sure that we get through all of those. But please use the Q&A function to let us know about questions or comments that you want to make as you hear the speakers. We are recording today's sessions, and I think we had just checked in with people beforehand about that, but just to repeat the fact that we are recording this. We are providing live captioning and subtitled videos in terms of accessibility for people who have got hearing issues, and Jade will share the link to that in the chat if anybody wants to use those functions. When you do have a question, if you want to put that question directly to the panel, please let me know, put your yellow hand up when we come to that part of it, and I'll make sure that you get a chance to do that. And I think it's just sort of in terms of setting the tone for a fruitful and positive conversation for everybody. I think it's just a reminder that, let's respect each other, let's engage with the topics, let's make sure that it's a positive and productive conversation for all of us. So very warm welcome to everybody. As I say, absolutely delighted that so many people have joined what I think is a really vital discussion today, because I do feel that it's the timing of this research that feels as important as the content, because there is no doubt that Scotland is in the grip of a devastating and deepening housing emergency. And that housing emergency is tragically getting worse every single day. We know from the latest statistics that came out from the Scottish Government at the end of September, every single day in Scotland, another 42 children become homeless. And they're joining the already record-breaking numbers of children who are stuck in temporary accommodation. And just in terms of that context about the housing emergency, another piece of the jigsaw for me is what local authorities are saying. 12 local authorities in Scotland have declared a housing emergency. And a report a couple of months ago from the chief housing officers of local authorities highlighted that 78% of councils are now breaking the law in at least one of their 3 key housing areas of statutory responsibility. And that's very much highlighted also by reports that we've had from Scotland's housing regulator. And the regulator's reported on the increasing risk of systemic failure. The regulator has indeed said that 10 local authorities are either in systemic failure or heightened risk of systemic failure. And just to be clear, what that means is the Scottish Housing Regulator is assessing those local authorities as not having the capacity and the resources to do the job. They cannot keep up with rising demand. I think another part of the jigsaw puzzle that I would think is important for us to bear in mind is another report that recently came out for the Scottish Housing Regulator that said the rate at which registered social landlords are building new homes has fallen for the last 2 years and is also projected to keep declining for the next 5 years. Now, Scotland has, without a doubt, world-leading, highly progressive housing rights and policies, but without that increase in the supply of social homes, our housing system is now becoming characterised by general decline and by failure. And I think it's also vital to remember that our housing system, yes, it's broken, but our housing system is also biased. Groups with protected characteristics, including women, are disproportionately impacted by the housing emergency. So any response to the housing emergency must be made from a gendered perspective. Women have specific needs, they experience distinct barriers in relation to housing and homelessness, and those must be recognised and addressed. So today, in launching this research and sharing it with people, Engender and Shelter Scotland hope that the detailed analysis of those issues in this research, alongside recommended actions will prove vital to start driving that real and lasting change for women across Scotland that we all want to see. So that's just a bit of context for today. I'm conscious that the slides are whizzing about a little bit, so hopefully we're just about at the stage where we can get into the speakers. So we've got quite a range of speakers today. I'm going to try and keep things to time, because I also want to make sure, as well as hearing from people and hearing about the research and perspectives on that, you get a chance to engage with the issues and ask your questions. So if we're set, I'm going to introduce the first two speakers, Lucy Hughes from Engender and Alison Tooms-More from Shelter Scotland, and they're going to provide an overview of the report, picking out the key findings, the conclusions and the recommendations. So Lucy and Alice, are you okay for me to hand over to yourselves?
Yep, great. Thank you, Alison.
Great, thanks so much, Alison. I'm Lucy from Engender. I'm a policy and parliamentary lead, and it's been fantastic working with Shelter on this joint report, which explores gender and inequality and the housing emergency. So if you could click to the next slide, Jade, that would be great. So as an organisation, one of the roles that Engender has is to link up conversations around structural gender inequality with key issues and policy areas such as housing and homelessness, which the housing emergency focuses on. What we really start with is that, acknowledgement that gender inequality is alive and well in Scotland. And these are just a snapshot of statistics that we use in some of our work to detail this. But women's lives are really shaped by, unequal access to power, decision-making spaces, such as the services and budgets that get set at local and national level. We see deep economic inequality, which I'm going to talk a little bit more to, which shape access to safe and affordable and secure housing. And also unequal caring responsibility. So women make up the majority of unpaid carers, do the vast majority of caring work for children, for disabled people and elderly people across Scotland, much of which goes undervalued and under-recognised. And then another key aspect, which is very kind of close to this conversation on the housing emergency, is the endemic nature of men's violence against women. So there's a couple of stats on that slide, but this is actually, nationally recognised in the Equally Safe strategy from the Scottish Government, which is about tackling and preventing men's violence against women. And all of these aspects are forms of gender inequality, which fundamentally shape women's lives in Scotland. And we have to keep that in mind when then looking at something like the housing emergency. So if you could do the next slide, Jade, that would be great. So the report really touches on a key aspect of this, which is women's economic inequality. And this means that women are in general more likely to experience poverty, and this affects their access to housing. Fundamentally, it's a key fault line of sort of the inequality that women experience. So won't have time to go into all of this, and it's detailed within the report, but we know on average that women are more likely to rely on social security, especially to meet housing costs. So we've seen 14 years of austerity and the inability for these entitlements to meet rising housing costs. I've popped a stat there that, women are the majority of those who need housing benefit to sort of meet housing costs. And we know that those benefits haven't been able to meet the rising cost of living, the rising cost of housing. So it's causing huge barriers to accessing affordable housing. And also I'm keen to sort of shout out the fact that that point on the impact of domestic abuse and men's violence is very, very closely connected to women's economic inequality. So I'd really appreciate if others on the call could sort of share their work and research in the chat, but Scottish Women's Aid in particular have led on this space, not only within economic abuse and economic inequality, but also on how that affects housing and homelessness for women experiencing domestic abuse. So for example, like 95% of women that experience domestic abuse also experience economic abuse, and research from Women's Aid shows that 1 in 3 survivors have to give up their home as a result of domestic abuse. So it's so closely tied into the conversations around the housing emergency. And very important to note on both of those slides that, women are not a homogenous group, and there are intersectional aspects of gender inequality. So if a woman is disabled or from a Black and minority ethnic community, there are completely kind of other compounding impacts of discrimination that shape their experiences of inequality. So I'll pass on to Alice for the next slide.
Thanks, Lucy. So in our report, we highlight that there is an urgent need to increase the supply of social homes, particularly larger social homes in Scotland, and that this is a gendered issue. Women are disproportionately more likely to social housing. So in Scotland, around a third of households with a female head of household live in the social rented sector, compared with fewer than 1 in 5 households with a male head. So when significant cuts are made to social housing budgets, for example, as we saw in December of last year, women are some of those most impacted by the resulting decrease in social housing delivery. Women who experience homelessness are also more likely to have children in their care. So in 2023-24, 75% of single parent households who were assessed as homeless were headed by a woman. And this presence of children often results in the need for larger social homes to move out of homelessness into. We also evidence in our report that households with children, particularly those headed by women, spend much longer trapped in temporary accommodation due to this lack of larger social homes available. Increasing the supply of social homes, particularly larger social homes, will increase women's access to safe, secure and affordable housing, and to form a core part of a gendered response to the housing emergency. If you could go into the next slide, please, Jade. Thank you. So secondly, I'm going to talk about the failure of homelessness services to properly respond to women's needs, particularly in terms of their childcare responsibilities and gender-based violence. Before I go into this, I just want to acknowledge that a lot of this information was provided by Rachel Cooney, from the Bridges Partnership, who's also on the call, and she'll go into a lot more detail about this later on when she shares her experience and her insight. So we know that homelessness services in Scotland are failing to meet the needs of people every day. However, a lack of gendered approaches to designing and delivering these services mean that women face additional barriers in getting those needs met, or their needs met, and being able to have their housing rights upheld. So in particular, there is a significant lack of knowledge among services on how to support women fleeing domestic violence. Many of shelters become homeless as a result of domestic violence report negative experiences when they've approached local authority homelessness teams, often speaking of the fact that they feel judged and their experiences of abuse are minimised and they haven't been taken seriously. We have also very concerningly recorded instances of women in Scotland fleeing domestic violence being denied access to homelessness services and temporary accommodation, which is a practice known as gatekeeping and is a clear breach of women's rights. This creates significant safety concerns for these women, as the point that they're most at risk of harm from the perpetrator of the abuse is at the point when they attempt to leave. Finally, in terms of temporary accommodation, women requiring access to temporary accommodation often have children with them. This creates additional requirements in terms of needing larger temporary accommodation and needing access to decent cooking and washing facilities. Unfortunately, there are increasing instances of women and their children being kept in really unsuitable and poor quality temporary accommodation, such as B&Bs. And this reflects the sort of wider constraints and pressures on TA supply in general, but just highlighting that it's having on women and their children. And then finally, safety is a significant concern for women who are experiencing homelessness, particularly in regards to accessing temporary accommodation, which is hostels and B&Bs. As a result, Shelter Scotland services regularly work with women who are unwilling to access temporary accommodation, despite the fact that this is what they need and it's their right to do so. And we can also see this issue reflected in official statistics, where women access temporary accommodation at a much lower rate than men. So 61% of female-headed households enter TA compared to 75% of male-headed households. Next slide, please, Jade.
Thanks. Alice. So just to link in on some of the statistics that we've been shown on the last couple of slides and that Alison was speaking to, we do have official homelessness statistics in Scotland, which are published yearly, and we do know some aspects of the gendered nature of homelessness through those. So the fact that, you know, domestic abuse is the leading reason for women that do present to services as statutory homeless. But however, a lot of our work is really highlighting that these official statistics do not tell the full picture of women's homelessness, especially for marginalised women. And there's, you know, no ability to kind of look at intersectional data within the statistics, although that is being worked on longer term by the Scottish Government. So what we know from research that has been done, mostly across the UK, but also internationally, is that women are much more a higher likelihood to have experienced hidden homelessness. So as Alice spoke about, you know, not necessarily accessing statutory services, but would meet that threshold, potentially seeking safety with family and friends and social networks rather than accessing kind of the accommodation being provided by a local authority. And again, women who aren't accessing these services, potentially it's because of negative experiences, perception, stigma around, you know, actually kind of presenting as homeless, and that has been explored in research. But also, like I said, that there's huge gaps on specific groups of women. You know, we're not able to look at the statistics and understand like disabled women's experiences of homelessness from those figures. We have to look at what are organisations telling us on the ground, what are women's sector and equality organisations seeing in terms of the people that they work with, and how is that evidence and research being valued alongside looking at the official statistics. We would say not enough, and that much more needs to be done to connect in, you know, the expertise of these organisations and the women that are within them to these kind of broader policy conversations. So really the broad point of this is that the official statistics tell us some of the story, but we have to proactively look at what is missing in terms of the gender research that we need to do, the data that we need to bring in from other sources to really understand the policies and the services that are required. Because otherwise, if we keep just looking at those kind of traditional sources, we're not going to have services that respond to need. And I think the issue on temporary accommodation is a really kind of strong example of that we're not creating the responses that are able to sort of meet women's needs, and therefore they're not accessing it. So that's a really important point that we want you to take away from today as a key message in the report as well. Next slide, please, Jade.
Oh, this is me. So finally, we're going to talk through some of the recommendations from the report. There's quite a few, we can't cover them all, but I just wanted to highlight some of the key broader ones. So firstly, unsurprisingly for Shelter Scotland, we are calling for the increased supply of social homes in Scotland to tackle gender inequality and to improve women's access to safe, secure and affordable housing, with again a particular focus on larger social homes to reflect that some of the households spending the longest trapped in temporary accommodation are women and their children. Then the final two recommendations I wanted to highlight are calling for homelessness services and temporary accommodation allocation and supply to be reassessed using a gendered lens and a gendered informed approach. This means explicitly considering women's needs in the design and delivery of these services. This will help remove the barriers that women face to getting their needs met, ensure that their safety is not put at risk, and that women's housing and homelessness rights are being upheld and enforced. I'll now hand over to Lucy to cover the recommendations that she'd like to highlight.
Thanks so much. And again, these are all in the report, so we can't put everything in, but there's a lot more detail in there in terms of a breakdown of what we're calling for. But one of the things that you know, Engenders are really keen that conversations on housing inequality and the housing emergency linked to are women's poverty, and really pushing for social security reform, but also targeted funds. So we call on, for example, the Scottish Welfare Fund to be used to reach women who cannot access other forms of statutory support. We've seen a successful pilot of the Fund to Leave from Scottish Women's Aid. We want to see a national version of that, which can help women, for example, with no recourse to public funds who cannot access other forms of statutory support. So there's quite a few recommendations around that, and it's absolutely key to these conversations about the housing emergency. Also, you know, like I said earlier, the experiences of domestic abuse are absolutely integral to women's experiences of homelessness, and we need to see services and support really linking into the expertise and the knowledge that we have of how to support women and their families experiencing domestic abuse. And there's a lot of kind of more granular actions, but also we're pushing for other kind of new ways to look at that beyond social housing as well, in other forms of parts of the system that need to link in better on that issue. And then I think this is really a takeaway that I would like everyone on the call to have who's working in the housing space especially, is to really kind of invest in new research and look at who is kind of interacting with the services and what the needs are of women that are either not coming through the door or who are actually interacting with the supports we have, and trying to make that core to the work that is about furthering gender equality as part of the mission that you have within your role and within, you know, taking action on this area. And for us, that's about sort of mainstreaming gender into all our conversations around the housing emergency and how we approach homelessness as a society. So I'll leave it there, but thanks so much for your time, and I'll pass back to Alison.
Lucy and Alice, thank you so much. I was scribbling away, and I'm sure lots of other people were. I think, you know, it just sets out what I was saying in my introductory remarks, that there's so much that is incredibly helpful about this research in terms of giving us the detail of things that I think a lot of us have come across many times in our work, but this gives us the detail to start making the arguments for the recommended actions getting taken forward. And I think we really want to see that action-orientated feel to things. Just to remind people, I'm sure you're processing lots from those inputs from Lucy and Alice. If you've got questions, do use the Q&A function to capture that. I'm now delighted to introduce Dania Thomas, who's the director of Ubuntu Women's Shelter, which is a charity that provides support for destitute women and people of marginalised genders who have no recourse to public funds. And I think this relates to some of those final points that Lucy and Alice were making. There's things that we know and there's things that we don't know and can't quantify, and that does include women who've got no recourse to public funds. So I'm really delighted that Dania can speak to us about the experience of women providing shelter emergency accommodation to women who are categorised as having no recourse to public funds, and just talking about the environments that are relevant to those women's experiences. So Dania, with great delight, very much handing over to yourself.
Thank you. Thanks, Alison. Thank you, Lucy, Alice, for your talk, and really I'm very appreciative of the report, because it kind of resonances in so many ways with the things that we are working with. So it's great to be in this space. Thank you so much for platforming our work. So I'd like to just kind of divide my kind of contribution into 3 bits in terms of where we started, where we are, and where we are planning to go. So we started really as we were a group of workers in the Unity Centre, and at the time there was a men's shelter in Glasgow, but nothing for women. And so we just got around together and we decided to do something about it. I mean, completely, you know, because we were the women who were coming in before they were getting into the formal asylum process. They didn't have any place to stay, and temporary accommodation is actually a critical reason why we set up. And so it's really reassuring. I mean, in some sense, it's you know, seeing it in the report again as something that still continues is. It's difficult. And so anyway, so then we decided to set up our own, to do something about it. And at the time, if you think about it as intersecting kind of circles, we were right at the center of 3 things. And again, some of this are mentioned in the report. So one is austerity. Secondly is the declining housing stock. So we were really in a setup where we couldn't rely on, you know, just getting ad hoc accommodation. for the women. And then the third thing that really triggered everything was the hostile environment, where destitution became state policy. And therefore, we were quite conscious, especially around the regulation of landlords and disclosure of information to the Home Office. So what we decided is we'll just get our own place. And naive as that was, I mean, that was the journey. We then got two donors who, and we could then buy our place in Shelter or in Paisley, and that's where we run. So this is where we set up. Now, what happened during COVID, in fact, just at the start of COVID, is a lot of the women who we accommodated were actually got papers, and they were coming back because they were now entering the labor market at a very bad time. And so we then kind of the office space, and then this kind of expanded the service provision, where we now have two women's groups that run in our office in the Delphi Center on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And then we have hair salon that we run with a local Eritrean shopkeeper in the townhead. And we do gardening with Galgil. So we have kind of different things that the women have come across and said, this is what we would like to do. We also work with amazing group of craftists who do kind of put forward experiences about the system out there through craft. So this has been an extension of our service. So as of now, what the key thing that I would like to draw attention to is what we are effectively doing is we are trying to replicate the state provision, and the report is clear around the serious gaps and the impact it has on it. I mean, the gendered impact of those structural kind of hard edges that define the experience of homelessness. And I think I really welcome the idea of thinking anew and afresh about a gendered approach. And this is some of the stuff that we are already working with the women. So recently there was a call by Rosa Foundation on asking for innovative ways around in this space. And Commonwealers also has an open call, especially around immigration, asylum, and in terms of innovative ways of how to think about accommodation. So one of the things we're looking at is really around, and again, it'll be really interesting to carry on this conversation around, what do we mean by gendered in this space, and how does it look differently from standard infrastructure that doesn't capture the experience, which the report really clearly sets out, of how women are affected in a very specific ways, which are very different from the way in which homeless men are affected, and the implications on children, on families. And so I think it's a wider piece than just having women in a space. I think those spaces need to be embedded, and the way we are looking at it in terms of the community has to be a critical part of that accommodation provision, because homelessness there, especially for women escaping domestic abuse, the community has a critical role in terms of how that woman is supported. So that needs to be part of that conversation. And with the far-right riots in August, that was a kind of a real tough time for us because we had to shut down our shelter and also our office because we were scared of reprisals because we are known in the close. So in terms of going forward, we are really keen to kind of participate and engage with research and bring our learning in this space, especially given the challenges that we still face in terms of infrastructure. I know there was a throwaway line in the Labour manifesto that said they were going to de-risk public infrastructure. And to me, that meant privatization and bringing in, private money into the space, which kind of has its own challenges. So if that's the way we're going to fix it, it's not going to be a permanent fix. So how do we kind of revive this conversation around the gendered approach? And very keen to see how that develops. I would, before I kind of end, I would like to, this is a poem that's kind of a working document, but it really captures the kind of experience both of the women that we've supported and also the experience of us as an organization, a specialist organization in this space. And it's a short poem, and I would like to present it. So the poem is called Shelter. Shelter. Our care moves, shifts. We are not confined to a place. We are not defined by a wage. Our care carries that cup of warmth to your lips. Our care lays out a clean pillow, sheets, and draws the curtains. Our care is permissible disarray, scattered fresh ginger root and pungent chilies, and the sound of thick maize porridge stir. Our care is a pot and a spoon stirring spice memories of home smuggled across borders. Your hair picks up glints of the dawn as blue braid. We sip brewed masala tea, break hot butter chapati and talk. You share dreams of your lived worlds we will never know. You come here with a song on your lips that we have no language to bear. You wear the weight of history like a crown of intricate design in burnished gold. You come through our barbed wires, our militarized walls, our CCTV tracking, our sniffer dogs, with your stories, your laughter. You come here through our bodies, algorithmized to contain, discipline, and extract value from your Black body. Your gaze into the distance does not forget, but you forgive. You carry the sea within you, that beautiful, clear water, silent with the pain of children and family you left behind. The sunlight picks up fish scales, adrift memories of a present continuous feeding frenzy as we gorge, destroy, suck everything dry to feed our first world lives. Yours is not a courage that comes with a gun or a knife or a militarized border. Yours is a courage that comes from knowing. We invented race and racism here, and this says more about us than it ever does about you. Our racism is skin deep, but becomes lethal when coddled with phrases like people make Glasgow. Do they? In this great city, people have always been left behind, but we pretend, we brand, we strut and play games with words like civilization and progress. Capital makes Glasgow on the backs of bodies that clean and care. The river bought slave ships and loot from the colonies, and now BAE systems bring profits and jobs from death and war. You see our bleeding feet as we walk on broken shards of amnesia and the hot coals of forgotten histories that holds a boot on our throats to silence and choke, not kill. As women's voices on the close, forgotten by history, rise sharply. Look at us, we have nothing too, but we will look out for you. The light fades, and in the gloaming, the shine of cheap chrome fittings on locks and iron gates meant to keep us safe. As the sun sets on the estate, the night birds shriek, and we wait for another dawn. So before I finish, I just would like to say one of the reasons why we exist is really because of the people who supported us and people across Glasgow, not least the people in the close, the women in the close. When we first bought our property there, we were really concerned about who we were going to, what reception we would face. So we had a meeting with all, and it turns out there were 7 women, single women in the close, and they were looking out for us, and they still do. So we are launching a fundraiser for another place because we've outgrown our shelter. And the name of the fundraiser is a tribute to the women in the close. It's on the 15th of November on Friday in the Transmission Art Gallery. So if you'd like to come and dance and meet all the mad people who make us possible, you're welcome. Thank you.
Oh, Dania, thank you so much. I'm not sure I've been at a conference where there's been a poem read out. And that poem was so beautiful, so powerful. I found myself being incredibly moved by that. And you might get a chance to see some of that reflected in the chat. And I'm not sure if you would be up for sharing the poem to people, but that's maybe something we can pick up. Thank you so much, Dania. Rachel, I'm going to invite you to try and follow that. Rachel works with us at Shelter Scotland. She's a senior housing rights worker with the Bridges project, which Alice mentioned earlier on. The Bridges project works specifically with women and children in the Glasgow area, women and children who have been impacted in some way by domestic abuse. So, Rachel, if you are happy to take us through your presentation, please do.
Thank you, Alison and Dania. Yeah, very tough act to follow, very tough. But I'll do my best. So yeah, like I said, my name is Rachel Cooney. I'm a senior housing rights worker on the Bridges Partnership project. The project is delivered by Shelter Scotland and Aberlour Children's Charity. We support women and children who have been subjected to domestic abuse in the greater Glasgow area. My remit's a little bit more wider, like I can go with the whole West Coast. So yeah, the project's been going for almost 12 years. I've been working here in this project for almost 3 years. And yeah, so in our remit, so in my role specifically, I am, as you can guess, the housing person. So I will work with clients, referrals we get. So referrals from like social work, housing associations, health visitors, self-referrals, referrals from anyone and everyone. So I work with them to achieve whatever housing outcome they want to happen, be it they have to leave the property due to domestic abuse, or they'd rather stay in the property but make it safer for them. It generally involves a lot of liaising with the local authorities or housing associations. I also do DASH risk assessments. We use those on a near daily basis with our clients. I refer to MARACs, multi-agency risk assessment conferences. So yeah, I'm IDA qualified, so I will bring cases to MARAC. I will also represent the client's views at MARACs. Yeah, they're like a great space. I guess in terms of the issues I see a lot of issues. But particularly the report, really one of the main issues my clients face, again, on a near daily basis, is just the lack of understanding of domestic abuse, the lack of understanding of the dynamics of domestic abuse and how that impacts on housing, how that impacts on many facets of someone's life. I've had clients who just have terrible experiences with housing. One client in particular, I remember she phoned me like distraught after an interaction she had where she went to make a housing application with the housing association of her choice, and just felt like she was judged, that she wasn't believed. Her experience was very much minimized. The client I'd gone with the client to make a homeless application. The homeless application was taken. That wasn't an issue. The client was advised of her legal right to get temporary accommodation. She disclosed to us a very traumatic event that happened previously in temporary accommodation. And at that time, she did not wish to access it, but was made aware that the option was ongoing. It was an ongoing option for her, should she need to access it. Unfortunately, the incident with the housing association, with the housing officer called into question her need to leave the property, her experiences of domestic abuse. And like I said, the client just felt judged and then felt forced to disclose this deeply traumatic event in her life to this person, to this housing officer who she doesn't know, and this housing officer who does not need to know. So that was like a very disappointing one. I've had calls I've tried to make, like advocacy calls with housing officers. I had a client where the client again had to leave due to domestic abuse, but wished to stay in the property but make it safer in the meantime until something suitable was sourced. So I was phoning the housing association to make them aware of the client's situation and to ask, would it be possible for extra locks to be put on the door. We were in the process of getting funding for a Ring doorbell to help the client feel safer. And it's not funny. I don't know why I'm funny. I think it was just the sheer, I was so taken aback by the answer. I still am today. The housing officer said, oh, but if the perpetrator comes to the door, the client just needs to be stronger and say no. Now, I rolled my eyes so hard on that phone call. It's a miracle I didn't drop the phone. But yeah, just again, that lack of understanding. I was like, I did point out to the housing officer that the perpetrator could kick in the door, has threatened to do so, and probably would. We were just trying to make, the client safer, and we really needed their buy-in for that. So yeah, just really disappointing interactions, and I guess it just really speaks to, like, clients have said to me, like, I don't want to engage with more services, with other services, because this is what happens. I've had clients tell me, oh, because of this response, it's like, this is why people don't come forward about domestic abuse, because this is the response we get. So it's just really disappointing. To kind of try to counteract that, I have developed a best practice awareness session. So I have been delivering sessions over the summer, and they've been quite well received, so that's good. Also great, the new Housing Scotland bill, all housing associations will have to have specific domestic abuse policies. Great. They should have had them, like last week, but we move. What else? And so yeah, just really tying in the need for, like, that specific training and understanding of, like, all services that are there to support women affected by domestic abuse, but particularly housing. It seems to be a real issue. Again, the lack of temporary accommodation is a massive issue, like, we're struggling with. Again, like Alice touched on, I have clients who, for their own safety, require access to temporary accommodation, but they're terrified to go into hotels and B&Bs. They're scared about, children, being there at nighttime. They're worried about how they will feed their children, the money to feed their children, how will their children get to school, where will they wash clothes, because buying food out every day is extortionate, laundrettes extortionate. And then the difficulty is they might get a temporary furnished flat, but it could be miles away from where the children's school are, where their support networks are. So that's, like, a huge issue we see. Yeah, and even, like, clients who require, like, supported accommodation, that's another major issue. I've had clients waiting for, like, months, like, to get a place of supported accommodation. It's just really difficult. Right now, I have a client who is in a temporary flat. Unfortunately, she was attacked by the perpetrator in this property, and again, just due to the lack of suitable temporary accommodation in the area she needs it to be, she's still having to live, at risk, and, like, with that every day. Yeah. I've had clients tell me that they feel as if they're the ones being punished, that the system does put, like, so much additional pressure on them for doing the right thing, and they feel as if they've been punished. A client told me, she was like, the perpetrator has his own house, and we've lost everything. We've lost all our belongings. We've lost our home, and there seems to be no repercussions for the perpetrator. So yeah, just really, and, like, the need for, like, bigger social homes, because again, clients who are in temporary accommodation or who are unable to access temporary accommodation due to the lack of temporary accommodation, they're waiting. I've had clients wait years. Or they might get an offer for property and it's just not the area they need it to be, or it might not be suitable. Again, we need bigger properties, 3-4 beds. We also need, like, ground floor properties. Clients who have medical needs, that's, like, an added layer of complication, like an added layer of, like, waiting, because there's not as many ground floor properties or, like, medically adapted properties. So yeah, just really to reinforce that recommendation of the report as well. And yeah, I think that is my time up. This is really something I could talk for weeks about, but we're cutting it short now.
Rachel, thank you so much. And before you dip off, I'm going to invite you to take the first question, because we did, as I say, have quite a number of questions coming in from people before the session. There's a couple of questions that I see in the chat as well, so I don't want to lose sight of those. But just a question that I think you might be well placed to pick up on from what you've said there, Rachel. It's a question from Laura Jones of the Scottish Tenants Association. So Laura, if you're on the call and I get your question wrong, please do jump in. But Laura's question was, how are we going to get women and children out of homeless hotels? What would your thoughts be on that, Rachel, from your experience that you've just spoken about?
It would really just be the need for like increased funding for, be it women's refuges, if that's what clients need, supported accommodation, if that's what they need, and just temporary furnished flats in like across the city. Yeah. And just like trying to enable that, those temporary furnished flats, those refuges that are provided are close to client support links, the schools, the health centre, family, friends, and just really making that a reality, because otherwise they're waiting weeks, months.
Yeah. And I think that relates to just the practical detail that you were providing there about the kind of cases that you see and the factors that just need to be thought through in a considered way when thinking about what is a suitable offer for accommodation, as well as what's an appropriate way to have those conversations with women in terms of understanding their needs and responding in a way that's authentically helpful. There was a couple of questions, Lucy, that I might pop to yourself. And again, if the people who've posted these questions are on the call and I get anything wrong or you want it to come in, please do so. So one was from Robin Patricia Duffy, who's a freelance journalist. And the question, Lucy, that I thought you might be able to offer some comments and thoughts on, what can the government put in place to ensure that young women are not becoming homeless due to disability? And you did make a reference to this in your presentation. I know there's quite limited insight from the research, but just to give you an opportunity to say a bit more in relation to that question.
Thanks, Alison. I think Rachel's actually even commented on the fact that so much accommodation isn't designed around disabled people's needs. So that's a huge part of it as well. But I think, in terms of the best actions, we work very closely with sort of disabled people's organisations, such as like Glasgow Disability Alliance and others, on trying to understand, what disabled women are telling them are the biggest barriers. And there was some research done with the Scottish Women's Budget Group to look at sort of how the cost of living crisis was impacting disabled women's lives. And it'll be no surprise that housing costs and the ability to access housing was a major factor, which, they were feeling a huge amount of pressure on. And I think, this calls that we make in solidarity in terms of removing social care charging. Social care costs are absolutely a huge driver of poverty and financial inequality for disabled women that then affects their ability to access housing. And we're seeing kind of reduction of health and social care packages across local authorities due to kind of budget constraints and decisions being made. And these are just having absolutely life-changing impacts on disabled women's lives, but also the ability of them to kind of, be in safe and secure housing. So I think, for more information, I would really encourage others to kind of look at disabled people's organisations campaigns around housing, but also I can pop a link into that briefing that was done with Scottish Women's Budget Group and GDA, which kind of looked specifically at disabled women's experience of the cost of living crisis.
Brilliant, thank you. And just maybe think slightly related to that, and this is a question from Emma Matthews from the Housing Support Enabling Unit, and again, Emma, do jump in if I get this wrong. But I just wonder if there's some related points in Emma's question, which is, do you find any barriers to women who've experience of homelessness in accessing housing support for independent living?
I would say, like, again, Engender is not a specific organisation for disabled people, so very much I would defer to disabled people's organisations that do detailed work on the impact of, independent living and the funds that are or aren't available to many disabled people, disabled women who are trying to, either deal with homelessness or access housing. So I can pop some links if we do sort of an email afterwards, can try and find some relevant research and as much as possible signpost to where that exists. But I think this also shows there are many unanswered questions about the intersecting inequalities that women are facing. And what I would really encourage is for people on the call to either share research they know of, but also start to ask these questions as part of approaching their own services or looking at you know, what research is needed to plug gaps, working within their communities and within the women that are, you know, either in touch with their services or they know partner organisations. For example, Ubuntu have connections with a specific group of women, like reaching out to those organisations and asking these questions so that we can have a better understanding. Because again, the official statistics are not going to tell us the answers to those really, really vital questions that have been asked as part of the Q&A.
Yeah. Brilliant, Lucy, thank you so much. Now, there's a question that is in the chat from Linda Thompson from the Women's Support Project. Linda, did you want to express that question yourself? Just to give you that opportunity?
Unfortunately, because of the webinar format, we can't have people unmute. We really want you to, but Zoom doesn't let us do that. So sorry, Linda,
I'm being too
got the
democratic
question.
the format. I'll read out the question. So Linda's question was from Women's Support Project. Through our work with women and with frontline services, we know if the clear links between housing, unstable housing, unsuitable temporary accommodation, landlords pressurising for sex for rent and increasing mortgages. And I think it's just a whole set of issues there about women having to sell or exchange sex for housing. So I think there's a range of issues there. And I think Linda's generally saying, did the research explore those links? How can we ensure housing as a risk factor is considered? Alice, is that something that you could provide some comment on to Linda's points?
Yeah, of course. It's a really good question. Broadly, the research didn't explore those links, unfortunately. I think because it's an area that has so much sort of shame and stigma around it, it makes it quite a difficult thing to research. But I would say that there are clear links between the broken housing system and sexual exploitation. That is a symptom of a housing system that's failing, but also gendered inequality as well, and those two things interacting. I'd also argue that it needs to be seen as a systemic problem rather than an issue that happens between two individuals, like a criminal issue. It's something that needs to be tackled on a systemic level by addressing both gender inequality and housing. But yeah, it's something that I would love to research more into. I think it's a really important topic. So thank you very much for raising that question.
And I think your final comment there is, you know, I'm kind of getting that from some of the commentary. I think this research is such an important starting point, but it can't be seen as the end point. I think we've been able to get into the detail and the evidence on a broad range of issues, and there's still more to do. And I think it's about using this as a launch pad and using this both as a call to action in terms of what we do about these issues, but also saying that we make that commitment to explore more. There's a couple of questions in the chat which I think are slightly related. One from Antonia, which is about just a question about the extent to which the research was solely focused on urban areas, whether there was consideration or examination of specific issues relating to rural parts of Scotland. And a similar question from Emma Jackson, Citizens Advice Scotland. So I just wonder, Lucy, if there's anything that we're able to say from the research about any distinct differences, rural versus urban, in terms of the information that was looked at?
Yeah, of course. I'm also really keen that Rachel and Dania can come in on any questions that you'd like, or even just react to what's been said. So please unmute and interrupt if you'd like to. But what I would say is that, again, one of the, like we were answering in terms of disabled women's experiences, there is a massive lack of research, especially in Scotland, looking at rural women's experience of housing specifically. So we have kind of, you know, some broad knowledge of general barriers in terms of rural communities, but we need more work to be done to kind of explore those and actually raise awareness of them. And, you know, we weren't able to get into the detail of every single kind of intersecting experience that women have, and rural poverty is not covered as a specific aspect, but it should be, and there needs to be more work to cover that and raise awareness of it. So I would just say, you know, we were quite limited in terms of like what's available out there, and if there is work we should be looking at, please signpost it to us. But we'd like people to go away and do this work so that actually it's not kind of obscure, and we're not asking questions about whether this research exists.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks very much. And there's a question that we had in from Anne Carlin, a local organiser with Unison and also active in Living Rent. And I want to make this an open question to anybody on the panel. So the question is, do you feel optimistic about the ability to use the housing bill in its current form to protect and promote the rights of women and address the housing crisis, and in particular its impact on women and non-binary people? And if not, what do you intend to do about it? So I just want to open that to anybody who would like to make a comment from our speakers today.
I'll take it up. In its current,
Oh, Rachel, go for it.
Sorry. Currently, yeah, I am like really optimistic about the provisions it's like promoting it, especially in terms of domestic abuse. I'm also happy. So another issue I would see a lot in my work is where someone's living in a private rented tenancy, and it's like a joint tenancy, but where there is domestic abuse, trying to end that tenancy without the agreement of both parties. And the new bill is proposing, and like only one party needs to end the bill. So that is like great, because for years that seems to have been a kind of legal issue to try and get around for us that I'd see in my work.
Brilliant. Rachel, did anybody else want to offer any comment on that? Housing bill is going to be stage 1 reading by the end of the month. Dania?
Yeah, so again, I kind of, the danger of it, I mean, at least this is a more general point, and I don't know the specific details of the housing bill, but my sense of just a reading of it is that so when you look at the context of austerity, especially the cuts in public services. So one of the referrals we've had a referral from social work. Somebody escaping domestic abuse, Friday evening, no place to send her. So she stayed with us. The perpetrator found her. It was horrific because we were not equipped to deal with, but we couldn't say no, and there was nothing. So that spillover. And the other thing is we've been approached by a local police service to take in women for one night a week who are trafficked, and they don't have resources to put them up. So the spillover, so it's a dynamic situation. And my concern is that if it's a top-down thing, like legislation, without actually factoring in, the more kind of general pressures on housing that are not confined to, housing itself. So it's coming from other places. So I think, I still think there is scope for setting up mechanisms that are more ground up, where, groups are getting together in order to say, okay, these are things that we can do given the context that we see ourselves in, as opposed to it, trying to get a fix from legislation. I think I'm not very optimistic. I'm quite cynical. So yeah, but that's just me. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Dania. I kind of sense that there's conversations that we could carry on from this, and I think that's very much what I'd like people to do. We have got a small 2-question poll that we want to just launch now. Jade's just going to launch that just to capture some thoughts from the conversations today. So it just gives us a chance to, plan future events. So hopefully you can just quickly give us your answers there. It's my great pleasure to express huge thanks to all of our speakers, Alison, Lucy, Dania, and Rachel. I found that incredibly stimulating and incredibly moving, actually, particularly your poem, Dania, and I know that's moved so many people. Hopefully everyone who's joined the conversation today has equally been informed and inspired to keep this conversation going. What are the actions we can all commit to, having heard and understood the issues and the recommended actions? What are the further work that we want to do, including more research to particularly capture the experiences of women who are hidden in the statistics and hidden from view at the moment? How do we bring those experiences to the fore so those specific issues and barriers are also dealt with? So I just Hopefully this is a conversation that will continue. Hopefully the issues that you've heard are a call to action for everybody who's been on the call. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to our speakers, and look forward to hearing what happens next. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much.